I'd like to talk to you about a fairly common response, especially from a believer when injustice occurs in their life or the results of the actions of a wicked person touch their life. And this will be taken from Psalm 73. And I've entitled this, "It's Not Fair, God's Justice and Man's Wickedness." How do we try to reconcile these two diverse and diametrically opposed approaches to life? Well, I want to go ahead and start with a case study. This is an actual event that took place in my ministry. Linda was raped by her youth pastor after years of sexual abuse. Her parents were horrified at the revelation. They seemed oblivious to what was occurring during her teen years. The youth pastor was arrested and tried and found guilty. But Linda was stunned. His punishment for this crime was 1 year probation. That was all. She sat in my office angry. "Where is the justice?" she demanded. "Why did he get off so easy?" she exploded. Even after the trial and sentencing, she had to get a restraining order because he began showing up at her work, stalking her. Though she had not seen him since the order of protection, when she came to me, she was furious. The sexual abuse and the rape was traumatic, but the arrest, the medical examinations, the detectives, the court, the testifying, and having to see him and listen to his attorneys make excuses for his behavior added and compounded the problem. But the final assault against her was of the degree of the punishment he received. In her mind, it was not sufficient for the type, the frequency, and intensity of his crime. How would you counsel this 22-year-old woman? It would be foolish to attempt to answer some of her why questions about God and his involvement. No human being can give an explanation for God's sovereign activities and purposes integrated with man's free will. Does the Bible offer any comfort? Any solutions? How would the Bible provide direction so she can rebuild her life? There are a number of counseling issues one would need to address. One which stands out in this case study is God's justice in light of man's wickedness. There are a number of passages you could teach her to apply. A powerful passage is Psalm 73. This is a psalm written by Asaph, the royal musician in the time of David and Solomon, according to 1 Chronicles 6:39 and 2 Chronicles 5, verse 11 to 14. Asaph struggles with the perpetual evil and wickedness of man, God's sovereign control and power, and his own walk of purity, obedience, and righteousness. Verse 1, Asaph affirms God's goodness. Even in the midst of his struggle, he recognizes God's goodness. He reminds himself that God has not forgotten his uprightness. God still rules in sovereign lordship. His administration is not corrupt. God has not been bribed. He does not partner or pamper the wicked. In verse 2, Asaph uses a metaphor to allow us to see his thinking. His mind is struggling to comprehend what he knows about God and what he sees, namely the evil, wicked, vile corruption of man. This intense mental battle nearly causes him to falter. He questioned the reality of God and who God claimed to be. He knows his thought process puts him in a slippery place without solid footing. His thinking was horizontal. He was losing vertical perspective. In verse 3, why was Asaph feeling this way? Well, he saw their prosperity of the arrogant and became envious. Asaph was wrestling with jealousy. His upright living did not compare to what the wicked seemed to have and experience. He flirted with wanting what they had more than wanting God. The prosperity spoken of here is not necessarily material, but a state of peace. The wicked seemed very calm and peaceful, seemingly free from trouble that bothered the rest of mankind. In verse 4, the psalmist thinks that when the wicked die, they should suffer because of their sinful deeds. Yet it seems they died relatively peaceful from all outward appearances. The pains and the agony of death did not seem to touch them. In verse 5, they seem insulated from the troubles and the hardships from what other experience. They seem to have an inside track, connections to avoid life's harshness. They seem to prosper and grow, almost finding favor with God and happiness. In verse 6, because of their position in life, they are proud and arrogant and insolent. They believe they are superior to others because they do not have the same problems. The text seems to indicate that even they flaunt their lifestyle as a reason they are not experiencing problems like others. While others struggles, they wear their garment of violence, meaning unsympathetic, uncaring, harsh and cruel to those who are suffering. In verse 7, they are not in need or want. They have everything they want and anything they desire. Barnes, in his Old Testament commentary, writes that their thoughts, their plans, their purposes pass freely along without any obstruction. Their wishes are all gratified. Their purposes are accomplished. They have all that they wish. Whatever comes into their mind as an object of desire is obtained without hindrance or trouble. They seem only to wish for a thing or to think of a thing, and they have it. In verse 8 and 9, they make fun of those who believe in God and try to live for God. They say, "Where is your God? Why does he not do something about your plight and difficulties?" They exalt themselves as if they were God, making pronouncements as to why religious folks are miserable and suffering and struggling. In verse 10, the scene shifts, and a good Bible student notes this. The psalmist returns to his earlier train of thought. Asaph uses an unusual metaphor, the idea of the people returning to this place means the return to a way of thinking. Asaph could not reconcile what he was seeing with who God is. He cannot get his hands around it. His mind cannot come to terms with the stark contrast. No matter how much he thinks, meditates, or reflects, his mind offers no relief or apprehension. When he refers to waters of abundance, this represents the bitterness of his futile thinking and failure to bring reconciliation to the two images. The tears shed, the countless sleepless hours leave Asaph empty. It is like drinking the dregs of poison to the very bottom of the cup. It is like drinking cold, strong coffee down to the bottom where the wet, cold grounds await your next swallow. In verse 11, Asaph stands too close to the edge of anger and faithlessness. He begins to wonder if God really is omniscient. Does God really know what is occurring? From all that the human eye beholds, how can God be so blind? Does he not truly see? And even perhaps God's ability to do something about these matters comes under scrutiny. In verse 12, here are people who live as if there is no God. They are happy, healthy, wealthy, and everything their hand seems to touch prospers. Their wickedness results in the Midas touch. Asaph is embarrassed to try and provide an explanation to any who may inquire, where is God? Why doesn't God vindicate the righteous and destroy the wicked? In verse 17, why bother to be a believer would be a way to summarize Asaph's turmoil. There is no reward. The harder I try to live for God, to keep his statutes and ordinances, the more difficult life becomes. It seems futile. Verse 14, he says, I have not known any prosperity. In fact, my life can be summarized by the word trials. When I awake in the morning, the trials I went to sleep with are larger and more alive than ever. And it seems that during the night, these giants went out and found some next of kin relatives. My life is so different from the wicked. In verse 14, all of this is churning in Asaph's mind. He is afraid to verbalize any of these thoughts. He dare not utter a word of his mental, emotional, and spiritual struggles about God. He knows that if he does, the impact on younger lives, not yet faced with working through this reality, would stumble them. He knows the younger generation is looking up to him. He has proclaimed the goodness of God. If he were to speak what his heart and mind are struggling with, what perhaps irrecoverable damage could be caused. In verse 16, no matter how much he tried to apprehend these troubling matters, what he saw and what he knew of God left him exhausted, leaving him drained. Barnes again comments that the question was a burden and too heavy for his weak powers. In verse 17, only when Asaph enters the sanctuary, the house of the Lord, was he able to find answers. Only in the presence of God was he able to understand where God was at. Before God's majesty, he began to understand what God was up to and how he would respond to the wickedness of mankind. The sanctuary was where God was. His glory was in the sanctuary. To reconcile these seemingly antitheses meant coming before the all-wise God, renouncing all human wisdom of understanding and interpretation, and trusting God. In verse 18, their end is described as a slippery place. Remember, this is how Asaph pictured himself when he reasoned without God. They would be cast down to destruction. The wicked would find no solid footing when God arrived. Their judgment would be swift, certain, and sure. No amount of prosperity or prideful railing would provide escape from God's perfect timing of punishment. In verse 19, their destruction is sure, but unexpected and sudden. It comes before they even realize it. They are so focused on what they have, who they are, and their denial of God that they think life will forever be the way they live it, uninterrupted. However, the destruction in the end will be appropriate to either what they have inflicted upon others or what they think they have avoided. Galatians 6:7 reminds us what they sowed, they will reap. In verse 20, the wicked person's bubble will burst. Reality will set in. God will not have any regard for their make-believe world. The evil person will awaken and see the end of their life. They will stand before a holy God. They will have no recourse. It will be too late. There will be no remedy. This brief life and the inequitable injustices will give way to the just and holy judgment which God will execute in perfect, absolute righteousness. After coming to realize these truths in verse 21 and 22, Asaph is deeply ashamed to ever have thought the way he did about God. He is shaken that he dreamed God was unfair, impotent, and uncaring. He likens his thinking to that of an animal who moves throughout life by instinct, not reason, reacting to his environment and circumstances. This is exactly what Asaph did. In verse 23, God is not offended by Asaph's thinking. God has not deserted him. God has not abandoned him. Again, Barnes writes, notwithstanding Asaph's low and unworthy views, notwithstanding his doubts about the justice of the divine administration, notwithstanding his envy at the prosperity of the wicked and his spirit of complaining against God, Asaph was not driven away from God. He was not banished from his presence or cut off from his favor. In verse 24, he returns to allowing God to be God. He welcomes once again God's guiding counsel. He trusts God. He knows he will be welcomed in heaven, and if God's justice is not measured out until then, God will deal with the unrighteous. Asaph now knows God will deal with their wickedness. What are ways that we can apply this or help someone who is experiencing the conflict between the fairness of God and the wickedness of man? The person who feels God is unfair and is dealing with them must be reminded and must affirm the goodness of God to those who are pure in heart. One who denies the goodness of God has allowed bitterness to overrun God's goodness. Second of all, the person who feels God is unfair and is dealing with them has to come to a point of recognizing they are close to stumbling and standing in a slippery place. Failure to start here may only result in behavior modification. Included in this admission is their jealousy and envy. Third, a practical exercise may to have the person list, like Asaph did for us, what they see in the wicked that they are envious of. Have the person describe that person's life. Here you will be able to contrast the temporal with the eternal, what the wicked have accumulated, that the wind will blow away like the chaff, and the endless faithful provisions of God. Fourth, have the person keep a record of how often they return to this thought pattern. When do they think about the unfairness of God in light of man's wickedness? What seems to trigger these thought patterns? Is there ever any relief? When and how do they find that relief? Next, instruct the person about the impact of their lie upon others. Are they sharing this anger and bitterness with others? Do they understand the impact they may be having on younger saints and unbelievers? The nature and purpose of the church? Generations have been impacted by unchecked sinful thoughts and practices. Just take a look at Abraham's lies that went to 3 generations. Next is the person complaining that it is useless to serve God. Do they point to their spiritual service record? What they are saying is, I am a faithful servant and I should not be treated like this. I have tenure. This reflects a misunderstanding about God and His purpose of when and how to reward. Read Matthew 20, 1-15. Next is the person entering into the presence of God, desiring to understand God's way or to demand God change His ways. God always welcomes honest inquiry, but never responds to demands and ultimatums. He is God, and there is none like him. His ways are higher than ours. Who is it that can counsel God? And finally, and even if the person comes to understand that God will vindicate himself when he deems it prudent, does the person's heart reflect sadness, sorrow, and a tender, merciful intercession for those who will one day stand before this awesome, terrifying, holy God? Because it could have been them, except they were saved by the grace of God. Teach them to allow God to be God and them to be God's servants. A final quote from Martin Luther says this: if his justice, referring to God, were such as could be adjudged just by human reckoning, it clearly would not be divine. It would in no way differ from human justice. But inasmuch as he is the one true God, wholly incomprehensible and inaccessible to man's understanding, it is reasonable, indeed inevitable, that his justice also should be incomprehensible.